So, good evening, everybody. Good evening. Can you hear? How's that? Better? All right. You can't hear me? All right. Now, can everybody hear me? Good. Okay. My name's Ann Kennedy, and I'm a member of the board of Tales of Cape Cod. I'd like to welcome you all tonight. I'm glad the weather cooled off. That's nice. But before we get started, there's a few little housekeeping items I'd like to bring up. So first, I want to remind you to pick up a program in the back of the room if you haven't gotten one already. We have hand sanitizers at the back when you come in, and we have hand sanitizers in the reception room. We do have a dessert reception after the talk, and it would be a real big mistake if you missed it, because they're homemade by Jude, and a lot of people come to these programs just for the desserts. So, no offense. No. So, our speaker will be present signing books, and I do want to give a shout out to Titcomb's Bookshop. They're located on 6A. If you haven't been to their shop, that's a treat, and you really should go there. It's excellent titles. They have paperbacks. They have toys. They have gifts. It's just wonderful. They also have a books signing series and talks themselves, so it's really good, and they've been very helpful promoting our programs. So I would like to also point out that our board member, Greg Masterson, has compiled a guide to the mural that is in our reception room. And I would like you to take a moment to look at the mural and identify maybe your house is on that mural. But it's very interesting, and he's compiled a history book that's in the reception room for you to look at that talks about the different houses along the route, and will feature their history and some of the more recent pictures of the same site. Also, we have a nice little historic marker out in front of the building, which is new this year. So that was put together by Phineas Fisk, who is another board member, and that tells a little bit of the history of the courthouse. So next week, we will host Joe Diggs. So old-timers like me will remember the iconic Joe's Villa in Osterville. I don't know about you, but that was taboo for me. I wasn't allowed to go there, so I used to have to sneak. But Joe is also an artist. You may have noticed the mural on the side of the barn on 6A, a little bit catty corner to this building. That's a barn owned by David and Diane Munsell, and Joe Diggs did the mural of James Baldwin on the side of that building. So he will be our speaker next week. So I understand, I have never heard him speak, but I understand he's fun and a dynamic speaker, so I recommend his presentation. This evening, we are very privileged to have George Mason University Professor of Religious Studies and award-winning author John Turner. Professor Turner will discuss his book, They Knew They Were Pilgrims. The pilgrims are portrayed in extremes very often. As rigid and tyrannical religious zealots, as brave conquerors of a new world, and hostile land, or benevolent partners with the native peoples. These are probably all true or not true at all. So Mr. Turner will move beyond the familiar narratives and give us a fresh and different perspective. I'm very pleased to introduce John Turner.
You really shouldn't clap in advance because you don't know if it's going to be any good. And if you just came for the dessert, that's entirely understandable. actually thinking of not signing books and just proceeding to desert myself at the end. I asked her how long I should speak, and it occurs to me this is a former, in addition to being a former courthouse, it's a former church. She said just about as long as a 17th century sermon. So, I'm kidding, she didn't say that. What I'd like to do this evening is start with two stories, the second of which, at least tangentially, involves Barnstable. And they're stories that, I think most people who know something about the Pilgrim and Plymouth story probably aren't familiar with. There are so many famous Plymouth colony names, Bradford, Alden, Standish, Church, Hinckley. The stories that I want to start with tonight involve people with much less famous names. And actually, in one instance, we know only a first name, and in the other instance, no name at all. The first story. In June of 1675, English soldiers and townspeople huddled in the home of the Reverend John Miles in Swansea, New Plymouth. Back in the 1650s, Miles had formed a network of Baptist churches and lay groups in southern Wales. When he did so, he celebrated that he could preach his version of Protestant Christianity without fear of persecution. He rejoiced that, these are his words, since the enjoyment of our precious liberty to hold forth the word of God to poor straying souls, many thousands are come to the profession of the gospel. Note his language, precious liberty. After the restoration of the English monarchy in 1660, Miles no longer had that liberty, and he very wisely moved to New England, first to the Bay Colony, then to the Plymouth colony town of Rehoboth. And it seems appropriate, I think, to begin with a Baptist minister, since this used to be a Baptist church. Miles was a powerful preacher, but not everyone was glad he had come to Rehoboth. Thomas Prince, the colony's governor at the time, soon complained about a majority vote gathered together by some discontents in a promiscuous assembly of servants who had chosen Miles as the town's next minister. Promiscuous, by the way, in this case, just meant that there were men and women there, not necessarily acting promiscuously as we would understand it. Actually, voting on a new minister is not a particularly promiscuous activity most of the time. In any event, Governor Prince and Reverend Miles worked out a compromise. Miles and his fellow opponents of infant baptism would leave Rehoboth and establish a new town, which became Swansea. The new settlements they established further encroached on native lands and were not far from Mount Hope, where the Poconokeets and their sachem Metacom, or Philip, lived. So that's the backstory. And now fast forward about a decade. The skirmishes that became King Philip's War began near John Miles's house. On June 23, 1675, a young settler shot and killed a native man near the settlement. The next day, 6 English settlers were killed in retaliation. And then that night, natives attacked Miles's house, which townspeople and soldiers were using as a garrison. Several men were shot. One of those was Alexander Kennedy, who happens to be one of Anne's ancestors, and I wanted to work him in. He was shot in the shoulder, but don't worry, he survived, which is why you're here. Plymouth Captain James Cudworth reported that for one wounded man, there was no hope of life. He identified the victim only as Mr. Miles, his Negro. Thus, one of the very first English casualties in this war was an enslaved African. He's identified not by his name, but as John Miles's property, Mr. Miles, his Negro. The case of John Miles points to some paradoxes about liberty in 17th century New England. In most respects, John Miles and Plymouth Colony's other religious leaders articulated very similar versions of Christian liberty. They just differed on the matter of infant baptism, which mattered a lot to both sides. And did the people of a town have the liberty to select a Baptist as their minister? But while they disagreed about infant baptism, no one took issue with the fact that John Miles held other human beings in bondage. Miles was one of Plymouth Colony's foremost slaveholders. According to probate documents, he owned at least 5 African slaves at the time of his 1683 death. They were listed right after his pigs and cattle and were his most valuable single possession. In these probate documents, we get some names. Peter, his wife Mary, and their 2 children, and a man named Adam. They were valued at a collective 72 pounds. Miles's will dictated that Peter, Mary, and one of their children be sold to pay the debts of his estate. And then he bequeathed to his grandson Samuel a negress forever. So that's one starting point. A war between English settlers and natives led, among many other things, to the death of an African slave. My second story I really only have in skeletal form. Her name was Maria. She spent a brief part of her adult life in Barnstable. I don't know where she was born, perhaps in the Caribbean, perhaps in Boston, perhaps elsewhere. As of 1673, Maria was the property of a woman named Margaret Cock, the wife of a Boston mariner. That year, Margaret Cock sold Maria to Walter Briggs of Scituate for 14 pounds and 10 shillings. She was probably quite young at the time, as a document several years later identifies her as a little Negro girl. The deed of sale clarified that Maria would serve Briggs and his heirs during her natural life. As it turned out, Maria was owned by 5 different members of the Briggs family over the next 20 years. First Walter Briggs, then his widow Frances, then their son John, then his widow Deborah. Then in early 1689, Deborah Briggs's will bequeathed Maria, identified then as a Negro girl, servant, for term of life, to Cornelius Briggs of Barnstable. Now, I'm working hard to work Barnstable in here. Cornelius Briggs didn't spend very much of his adult life in Barnstable. A few years earlier, he had married a Barnstable woman named Mehitabel Allen, one of those solid but obscure Old Testament names favored by New Englanders back then. The couple apparently lived for a while in Barnstable before he moved them back to Scituate. A few years later, Cornelius Briggs died. His will declared that his Negro servant woman named Maria shall, 13 years after date, be set free and at liberty to be at her own disposing. By this point, Maria was probably around 25 or 30 years of age. So theoretically, she would become free maybe around her 40th year, 45th year. Cornelius's brother James, the executor of his estate, sold Maria to Stephen Otis of Scituate for 11 pounds, stipulating that she would serve him for 11 years. A couple of years had passed by this point. We don't know, or I don't know, whether Maria lived another 11 years. Don't know whether she ever received her liberty. If she lived that long, did Stephen Otis honor that agreement or not? So, why start a talk on a history of Plymouth Colony with anecdotes about obscure slaves in Swansea, Scituate, and Barnstable, and about people who lived half century after the famous folks on the Mayflower? It's not because, as far as I'm concerned, the Pilgrims are trite, or because we don't need to hear their story for the umpteenth time. I don't know whether folks in this part of New England get pilgrim fatigue. I don't know if that's a thing. I don't have pilgrim fatigue myself. Down in Virginia, I think people are more likely to have pilgrim envy when it comes to early American history. There's some folks in Virginia, they claim they had the first Thanksgiving, but they don't have any proof of it. So, you know, you can find some Thanksgiving down in Florida in the, 16th century anyway. But I talked about Maria and John Miles's slave, not because Americans need to leave the Pilgrims behind and move on to other stories. Rather, I want to use these stories about Plymouth Colony slavery to engage some current American arguments about our nation's past. I don't know whether Americans are more contentious than other peoples, but we seem like a very contentious people. We argue about important things like vaccines and masks. We argue about chicken sandwiches. There are big arguments about that down in Northern Virginia, which place has the best chicken sandwich. Apparently, we're entirely polarized on nearly everything, though if you took the time to look at newspapers from the 1800s, you would realize that this is hardly unprecedented. And we argue about history. In fact, it seems that we can't even agree when America began. When and where and how does the story of the United States begin? There are some obvious possibilities, such as 1776 in Philadelphia, or 11 years later in 1787, or the ratification of the Constitution a couple of years later. Recently, though, there's been a lot of sound and fury surrounding the dates 1619 and 1620. The 1619 Project of the New York Times contends that African slavery is the country's original sin, but it is more than that. It is the country's very origin. Some school districts are using the 1619 Project to encourage students to grapple with the centrality of slavery and racism over the breadth of U.S. history. There's also been a great deal of pushback against the 1619 Project, some from eminent historians, others from politicians such as Donald Trump, John Cotton, and others. The Florida Department of Education recently banned the use of the 1619 Project in the classroom. Our former president even established a 1776 commission in response to the 1619 project. But what has also caught my attention are attempts to revive the importance of 1620, the Mayflower Crossing, and the establishment of Plymouth Colony. The National Association of Scholars and the media outlet The Federalist both established 1620 projects, setting up a clash sort of between Jamestown, slavery, and 1619 on the one hand, and Plymouth, liberty, and 1620 on the other. Whew, that was a lot of dates. Everybody always says you shouldn't make history all about dates, but not everybody listens. Now, there are some real issues about how students of different ages should learn about and engage the American past. But maybe starting with something small, what I want to do tonight is emphasize that 1619 versus 1620 poses a very misleading and unnecessary choice. For starters, 1619 marks the advent in Virginia of both African slavery and representative democracy. 1619 is the year that the first shipload of African slaves reached Virginia. It also marked the advent of what became the House of Burgesses and elected representative legislature. As a great historian named Edmund Morgan argued a number of decades ago, American slavery and American freedom developed in tandem alongside each other. The same was true in tiny Plymouth Colony. The colony established by the Mayflower passengers remains important for understanding the development of liberty in America. But the Pilgrim colony and its English settlers also participated in the enslavement and exchange of human beings, both native and African. In fact, it's impossible to understand English ideas about liberty without reckoning with liberty's stark opposite. The subjects very much go together, and we're best off examining them as two parts of the same story. So, first some thoughts about liberty in Plymouth Colony, and then about slavery and how those two subjects fit together. For most Mayflower passengers, liberty first and foremost meant Christian liberty. And I kind of feel like I'm in a pulpit, so I should have a biblical quotation. So here it goes. "Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free," wrote the Apostle Paul, "and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty." For most English Protestants, the yoke of bondage was Catholicism and anything that threatened the Protestant watchword of salvation through faith. But the majority of Mayflower passengers weren't typical English Protestants. They were separatists, men and women who had withdrawn from the Church of England to form their own congregations. They had covenanted with God and with each other to walk in the ways of God as they understood them. They thought the Church of England itself was under that yoke of bondage with its bishops, church courts, and unbiblical ceremonies. For them, Christian liberty meant the obligation of true Christians to withdraw from that corrupt church and to form their own covenanted congregations. And then they would elect their own officers, admit new members, and exercise church discipline. Exercising church discipline doesn't sound like a super exciting thing to do to most of us these days, but it mattered a great deal to these folks. John Robinson, minister to many of the Mayflower passengers in the Dutch city of Leiden, conceded that his congregation's government was, after a sort, popular and democratic. And that was a concession of his to use that word, because democracy was sort of a dirty word in the early 1600s. Now, it's worth noting that nobody else in England liked separatists. There's a line in Shakespeare's Twelfth Night about how being a separatist is just as bad as being a politician. Those are two just awful things, be a politician or a separatist. The basic idea of Christian liberty was important to really all other English Protestants as well. But separatists had their own flavor of Christian liberty, one that demanded the immediate self-determination of lay people. John Lothrop and the other early settlers of Barnstable had very similar views. They also came out of that separatist tradition. There was a basic congruence between the separatist vision of Christian liberty and the agreement signed aboard the Mayflower, which eventually became known as the Mayflower Compact. The authors of that agreement referred to it as a covenant that created a body politic. One covenant fashioned a congregation of the body of Christ, the other a body politic. The Mayflower Compact was a makeshift agreement, necessary in part because the ship had missed its intended destination and because the passengers had no patent to establish a colony and government in New England. There was a brewing mutiny and the risk that some of the passengers might simply go their own way, leading to the colony's collapse. The compact is very terse and mostly boilerplate, both in its expression of loyalty to King James and in its talk about the glory of God. In the 19th century, and in some quarters down to the present, straight lines have been drawn from the cabin of the Mayflower to the Constitutional Convention. And that's mostly fantasy, I think. The framers of the U.S. Constitution took their cues from people like John Locke, not from, separatist pilgrims. Because past Americans sometimes exaggerated its importance, I think it's easy to overlook the compact's significance. It articulates a basic principle that still resonates with Americans today, or at least should resonate with them. And that principle is clear and important. The compact affirmed that those who belonged to the body politic held the authority to enact, constitute, and frame just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices. In other words, the legitimacy of laws and offices rested on the consent of the people. Church members could choose their own religious officers. They could choose their own minister. Male members of the body politic, well, all of the members were male, members of the body politic could choose their own magistrates and laws. 16 years later, Plymouth Colony's political leaders read the compact aloud when they assembled to revise the colony's laws. They affirmed that laws and taxes could only be imposed on them by consent, according to the free liberties of the state and kingdom of England. There's a long tradition of consent in English thought going all the way back to Magna Carta. But there was something really unusual in Plymouth. The body politic established on the Mayflower was really shockingly, stunningly broad by 17th century standards. Nearly all of the adult male passengers signed it, in some cases servants alongside their masters. And maybe some of them were forced to sign it or coerced to sign it. That's possible. We don't really know. But there were blunter ways of tamping down mutinies than by giving unruly men the right to vote. And nevertheless, that's the way the Pilgrims chose to go about it. And in a visible demonstration of the compact's principle, right after signing it, the members of the body politic selected a governor for the next year. And they held annual elections for the next 70 years, with a few exceptions during times of crisis. By way of contrast, the first representative assembly in Virginia did meet in 1619, but company leaders back in London still appointed a governor and a council. From the start, the Plymouth colony votes that mattered were cast in person, not on the other side of the ocean. So there are two important ideas about liberty in Plymouth colony. That ideal of Christian liberty, and then that ideal of political liberty enshrined in the compact. The fuller story of liberty, both sorts in Plymouth colony, is a more complex and long story. Baptists, Quakers, Presbyterians, others brought their own understandings of Christian liberty to the colony, and the principles of the Mayflower Compact were contested as well. In the closing years of the colony, there was a widespread tax revolt that extended from the Cape to the western townships. It stemmed from the fact that courts were imposing taxes on individuals without their consent. So liberty and contests over its meaning were really the warp and woof of Plymouth colony. Liberty mattered a great deal to these settlers. So that's one part of the story. But what I want to suggest is that this story can't be told properly without full consideration of liberty's opposite, slavery. Until recently, I think one might have been forgiven for thinking that slavery was not an important part of Plymouth colony's history. There's an English official named Edward Randolph who was particularly loathed by folks in the Bay Colony because he loathed them as well. He visited Plymouth in 1676, and he reported back that there were no slaves in the colony, only hired servants. Many historians actually have echoed that view. John DeMose, who wrote a marvelous portrait of family life in Plymouth a number of decades ago, observed that Negro and Indian servants were very uncommon until after the Old Colony period. And I think this view is in accord with the sense that Plymouth colony was a tiny, isolated, impoverished backwater. You know, one would hardly expect to find slaves in a place removed from the larger intellectual and economic networks of the Atlantic world. Well, that turns out to be incorrect. There's been a lot of excellent scholarship on the history of slavery in New England in recent years, focused both on African and Native peoples. And I want to step back just for 1 minute what does it mean for somebody to be enslaved? That's not necessarily a simple question to answer. There's a historian named Andre Resendez who argues or suggests that enslavement generally involves forced removal of the victims from one place to another, an inability to leave the workforce, violence or the threat of violence to compel work, and nominal or no pay. I think Americans are generally used to thinking of slavery only as a lifelong, inheritable condition, because that's what it meant for most African slaves. But that's really too narrow of a point of view or of a definition. Is someone forced to work for another family without pay for 25 years a servant or a slave? In the 17th century, English sources would have referred to that individual as a servant. I'm not sure that's the best term. What about someone sentenced to lifelong servitude for stealing a horse? Is that individual a servant or a slave? In early New England, there are many examples of peoples who would fit a more expanded definition of slavery. The English servants who were taken to the Marymount outpost on the rim of Massachusetts Bay in 1624. An Irish man killed during King Philip's War who was part of an English settler's estate. Perhaps even an English settler sentenced to servitude because of vagrancy, indolence, and Sabbath breaking. These individuals certainly weren't free laborers. But most individuals from Plymouth Colony, whom we would regard as slaves, were native or African. Native slavery, in fact, played a very critical role in the colony's founding. In the decades prior to the Mayflower, a number of English ship captains had kidnapped natives along the New England coast, often taking them to England to groom as guides and interpreters. In 1614, one of those ship captains seized 27 natives, 20 from Patuxet, the future site of the Plymouth settlement, and 7 from among the Nausettes on the Cape. African slavery is certainly not the only American original sin. That ship captain sold them for slaves for 20 pounds each in Spain. In all likelihood, most died during the crossing or soon afterwards. Catholic priests apparently rescued some. One of them, Tisquantum or Squanto, somehow made his way to England and then secured passage home. Squanto, a former slave, was invaluable to the Pilgrims until his late 1622 death. Relations between the Pilgrims and native communities were from the start far more rocky than the American Thanksgiving myth suggests. In 1623, the Pilgrims launched a preemptive strike against natives on Massachusetts Bay, treacherously murdering several and bringing the head of one enemy back to Plymouth. As far as we know, at least during the early years, the Pilgrims did not consider taking natives captive and enslaving them. I don't think they would have wanted any substantial number of natives living and working in their settlements. They preferred to, keep them at a safer distance. But the enslavement of captives was a well-established biblical and legal principle. He that was taken in battle, reasoned that English philosopher Edmund Coke, should remain bond to his taker forever. Generally, this principle wasn't applied in wars among European peoples, but New England settlers put it into practice beginning with the Pequot War of the 1630s. Some Pequot War captives ended up in Plymouth Colony. In 1648, former Mayflower passenger Susanna Winslow sold a native boy named Hope to a ship captain bound for Barbados. Hope was likely a Pequot captive. He worked alongside a number of English servants on the Winslows' extensive estate in Marshfield. When Susanna Winslow sold Hope, the bill of sale specified a 10-year period of service. But it's fair to say that in their disposal of him to the Caribbean, the Winslows treated Hope like a slave, not like an English servant. Unless one of their English servants had committed a serious crime, it would have been unthinkable for the Winslows to sell his labor to a Barbadian planter. Yet they sold Hope, who almost certainly never became free. As English settlements expanded, Indians and English more frequently lived in relative proximity, and settlers became more eager to exploit an inexpensive source of labor. As traditional means of subsistence disappeared, more native men, women, and children worked in English households. And those arrangements were not always voluntary. Plymouth's General Court passed a law that Indians, especially young men, as run in debt to any English, shall be made to work it out at reasonable rates. That's like a sloppy law, you know. Indians, especially young men, as run in debt to any English. I mean, you know, maybe if they're not terribly vigorous laborers, you wouldn't want to make them work it out at reasonable rates, but if they're young men, it'd be a good idea. Even harsher punishments were a possibility. In 1674, Plymouth's magistrates sentenced a native man named Hoken to be sold or sent to Barbados. Hoken had been jailed for theft. He escaped and stole a horse, but was eventually found and sold into slavery. For the development of native slavery in Plymouth Colony, King Philip's War really was the great turning point in the mid-1670s. The seizure and sale of captives cleared lands of native inhabitants, raised funds for colonial governments, and gave English households a cheap source of labor. These developments have been well documented by many historians, but it remains stunning to me that hundreds of natives were exported from Plymouth Colony during the war to places as far away as Tangiers and possibly Madagascar. Hundreds more remained in the colony, but were reduced to various terms of servitude. Before undertaking the research for this book, I knew about the enslavement of natives in the wake of that war. But I was surprised at the sheer commonness, ubiquity of native servitude in the closing years of the Plymouth Colony period. Were these individuals servants or slaves? Again, English records almost unfailingly refer to them as servants. And a hodgepodge of colonial statutes, indentures, and bills of sale created a lot of ambiguity. The result was that many natives labored for English households in a murky and ill-defined capacity. But whether their masters called them servants or slaves, they were in bondage. They lived under a yoke of bondage. One of the most prominent native leaders in the colony during its later decades was a woman named Awashanks, who led a community at Sakonnet, present-day Little Compton, Rhode Island. she managed to hold her community, her people, together through King Philip's War. During those years, they lost all of their land, but the community nevertheless survived. In the process, though, Awashong's son, named Peter, lost his freedom. He became indentured, or possibly enslaved. In the inventory of one English settler's estate, he was valued at £3. I started with a couple of stories about African slaves in the colony. Their number also grew during the colony's last 2 decades. John Miles, the Baptist minister with which I began, he was unusual in owning at least 5 slaves. And in total, only a small percentage of English families owned African slaves, who were far more expensive than native forms of labor. Plymouth's government never passed any laws regulating or codifying African slavery. But if one looks carefully through the records, one can find many instances of African slavery in Scituate, Barnstable, Bristol, Little Compton. In other words, across the colony. English settlers were accustomed to seeing Africans in bondage, and they understood that it was a lifelong and inheritable condition unless an owner chose to free his or her slaves. English settlers wouldn't have been surprised to see an enslaved woman like Maria. So in Plymouth Colony, these 2 threads developed alongside each other, liberty and slavery. In fact, the English argued and used that language of liberty often in conjunction with discussions of slavery. They didn't want to be deprived of their liberties and made slaves. They equated the deprivation of political or religious liberty with enslavement. There were some objections raised to the lifelong enslavement of natives in the colony, but as far as I know, no English settlers in Plymouth Colony objected to English ownership of African slaves. What do we do with this history, you might ask? Perhaps some of us are outraged by the blind spots and transgressions of those in the past. Or maybe at the same time, inspired by past leaders as well, both by native leaders like Awashonks and English leaders like William Bradford. Mostly, I think we should be humbled by the past, moved to learn more about those who came before us, figuring out how they understood their world and their place in it broadens our own lens on things, gets us out of the narrowness of our own present-day times and places. We are, after all, both very different from those who came before us, and at the same time, very much like them, often concerned for our own liberty and our kin, much less concerned about the fact that others live without the liberties we might cherish. Thanks very much. I'd love questions on anything pertaining to Plymouth Colony, whether or not I talked about it tonight. Yeah. Yes, please go ahead.
You mentioned the termination of the Plymouth Colony. What event caused that? Or what were the circumstances of your definition of the end of the Plymouth Colony?
Sure. Well, in 1684, oh, sure, that's a great, thanks for reminding me. The question is, what precipitated the end of the colony, or how do I define the end of the colony? So in 1684, I'm pretty sure I have the year right, the Crown nullified the charter of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and at that time decided to essentially create a larger dominion of New England. And they sent a very much disliked governor to Boston, and in conjunction with a revolution back in England, there was a bit of an uprising there. Plymouth Colony never had its own charter, though since the Crown could nullify them, they were only so worthwhile anyway. But there was, uncertainty at that point about whether Plymouth Colony would continue to govern itself or whether it would be affixed to Massachusetts Bay. And in my opinion, Plymouth folks simply didn't pay sufficient bribes to the right English officials. And so that's what ended up happening. The Crown created a somewhat larger province of Massachusetts Bay, and Plymouth's counties, 3 counties at the time, became attached to Massachusetts Bay. There were plenty of people in Plymouth. I think then Governor Thomas Hinckley was one of them, who didn't think that was a terrible outcome. Sort of the Bay Colony Puritans and the Plymouth Colony Puritans weren't too different. There were a lot of other people, actually, who were quite upset about it, including Quakers in Sandwich and Baptists in the western part of the colony, who had sort of obtained a grudging amount of religious liberty in Plymouth and then had less when they became part of the Bay Colony. So it's a great question. Yes?
The last time I was at Plymouth in the native village, the natives were talking, like a Gaelic character.
Mm-hmm.
And they were telling me that Squanto was not who they thought he should have been. They weren't enamored with him. Have you heard that?
Sure. I mean, so, there's a line in William Bradford's history, and if you didn't hear the question, it was a suggestion that maybe not all of the Wampanoags were enamored with Squanto. And I think the reason for that is, as Bradford comments, Squanto played his own game. That was one of Bradford's favorite sort of phrases. He uses it a couple of times to describe a couple of people. And the idea is that Squanto is trying to accumulate influence and power using his relationship with the English against the Pokanoket leader Usamequin, or Massasoit as the English called him. So I think that's probably what they were referring to. And if you go with Bradford's history, that does seem to have been the case. That Squanto used his relationship and influence with the English for his own purposes.
And how did he die?
Well, he died, I don't know exactly what disease it was, but he was on a trading mission. There was actually all of this intrigue and uncertainty about where his true loyalties lay. But the Pilgrims really found him indispensable. Although a few of them, like Edward Winslow, had learned Wampanoag, most of them hadn't, and they really valued Squanto as a translator and guide. And so he was on a trading mission around the Cape. I think they'd gone around the tip of the Cape, and he died during that trip. So, great question. Yes?
Going further on that, there's some people that say he was poisoned by the Wampanoags. Have you seen anything that say that?
I haven't. Was Squanto poisoned by the Wampanoags? I haven't seen anything to suggest that he was. And also, I would, by that point, I would say that his main enemies would have been, peoples to the west of Patuxet, Plymouth, not people around the Cape. So, I think that's relatively unlikely, but you never know. So, yes.
Two questions. One of which is that, did you say something about how much there was slave trading using labor here.
So,
How that shifted once it was mass sped.
sure. So that's a good question. So were we talking slave trading across the Atlantic or mostly within the colony or within New England? So that was an example. There's that first example of it was a Captain Hunt who had sold Squanto and others in Spain. And the English, including the Pilgrims, really denounce him for that. That's something the Spaniards would do. English wouldn't do anything like that. And then in the by the 1670s, the English are certainly comfortable taking war captives and selling them elsewhere. They want to sell them in the Caribbean. The Caribbean, British colonies in the Caribbean, they don't really want them because they think they might, revolt. And so they have trouble selling them there. They do take some across the Atlantic to places like Tangiers and to Spain. Mostly, though, they're sold among the colonies, various places in New England. Those would be the bulk of the transactions. Good question. Yes. Did you want to follow up?
The second question is something, could you say, elaborate about the clash between matrilineal ownership of property in the Native American culture versus the patriarchal and the colonial culture? How that played out?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. The question is, can I say something about sort of a clash or contrast between matrilineal ownership of property in Native societies and patriarchal structures in English societies? I mean, maybe I could say something about it, but I don't know if I'm prepared to say anything intelligent about it. And usually in those circumstances, I try not to say anything. I would say, though, you can find many instances, despite the obviously patriarchal nature of English societies at the time, of women also owning and disposing of property, including married women. So, Susanna Winslow, her husband Edward is in London at the time. Well, she's managing the estate. She's selling a native laborer to Barbados. So, I mean, it's also interesting. I would say, one thing I would say is one shouldn't presume that English women in the 17th century don't have opportunities to exercise a certain amount of economic agency. So, yes?
Why do you think African slaves were valued more than indigenous people, or Native Americans?
So that's a great question. So in the wake of King Philip's War, the question is, why are African slaves valued more? Why are they priced higher than native slaves? I would say relative scarcity at the time. But it's more than that. So in the immediate aftermath of the war, one could purchase a native slave for 2 or 3 pounds. At the same time, it would cost around 20 pounds, 15 pounds, maybe to purchase a young adult African slave. I think one reason, in addition to scarcity, is the fact that it was clear. It wasn't legally codified, but it was clear that one could hold that individual for life. And if that individual was a woman, one could also hold that woman's children as property. Because native slavery was more contested, I think it was much less clear. There were some English masters who claimed the children of native slaves, but it was contested and sometimes they lost in court. There was also great concern that native slaves would run away, and if they did, it was much harder to get them back. So I think that also played into the difference in relative costs as well. It's a great question. Do I have time for one or two more?
Yes, one more, but I would like to suggest that Mr. Turner will be here signing books, and so you probably could engage him in a conversation while he's doing that.
Okay.
But
I got permission for one more, though.
yeah.
So, okay, good. Okay, go ahead, please. I think you had a question.
I think that perhaps the Pilgrims didn't control the value of the Negro slaves, the black slaves, because they were used as slaves in other countries. So that the other countries set the value. I'd like to ask a question concerning when the Pilgrims left England, they went to Holland, and they were afraid their children were becoming Hollandese or
Dutch, yeah.
and so they wanted to get them out of that environment and to another country. They had 2 ships for that purpose. One of them proved to be leaky, and so they abandoned that ship. Then they crowded everybody into one warship, but they couldn't take everybody. But when the ones they took weren't all of their religion. And what happened to those who were who demanded a second ship, but all of a sudden there's too many, so they take
Sure.
non-pilgrims with them?
So it's a great question. So, what happened to those who were left behind when one of the ships got leaky, and why do you end up with some non-separatists on the Mayflower? Well, the reason there were non-separatists on the Mayflower is because there weren't enough separatists, and the adventurers or the non-separatists, they would pay to go. And so it was economically beneficial. Some of those who were left behind really thought they'd dodged a bullet because there was a lot of fear about going as well. Some of them came later, maybe most prominently Robert Cushman came briefly the next year. And he clearly, I think also lost some courage before the Mayflower sailed and chose not to go for that reason. There's sort of a trickle of other people from Leiden who come really over the next 10 years to Plymouth. There's some members of the congregation who come as late as around 1630. So those who didn't have means to come initially, if they were determined, they came later. And yes, it was a point of conflict that there were also non-separatists who were part of the voyage. I'd be happy to answer more questions over dessert or books. Thanks for your attention and good questions.